Ethan Caldwell was a man who had risen from nothing to become a global powerhouse in the business world. Born into a modest family, he had worked tirelessly, transforming every challenge into an opportunity. His empire was built brick by brick through sleepless nights, calculated risks, and an unshakable resolve. By the time he turned 50, Ethan's name was synonymous with power, wealth, and influence. He commanded respect in boardrooms and inspired awe in the media. Some admired him, others envied him. But to Ethan, none of that mattered more than his son, Adrian. From the moment Adrian was born, Ethan's world shifted. For all his professional achievements, his son was his crowning joy. Ethan envisioned Adrian continuing the Caldwell legacy, building on what he had worked so hard to establish. Determined to give his son the best start in life, Ethan spared no expense. Adrian attended the most prestigious schools, had access to the finest mentors, and was surrounded by opportunities most could only dream of. At first, Adrian seemed like the ideal heir. As a boy, he was curious, bright, and eager to please. Ethan often marveled at how quickly Adrian picked up on lessons, whether in school or life. Ethan believed that his hard work was paying off, that he was raising a son who understood the value of determination, integrity, and effort. But as Adrian grew older, something shifted. By the time Adrian reached his 20s, he had become unrecognizable to Ethan. The boy who once eagerly sought his father's approval was now indifferent. Adrian grew accustomed to the luxuries surrounding him, treating them as entitlements rather than privileges. He became arrogant, dismissive of those he deemed beneath him, and uninterested in the values Ethan held dear. Ethan tried to rationalize Adrian's behavior at first. Perhaps it was a phase, a byproduct of youth and wealth. But as the years passed, it became clear that this wasn't temporary. Adrian seemed to lack gratitude, humility, and the drive to truly earn his success. Instead, he relied on Ethan's name and fortune to navigate the world, caring little about the effort behind it. This realization tore at Ethan's heart. He had always believed that wealth was a tool, a means to create opportunities, not a crutch to breed complacency. He had envisioned Adrian as a partner in expanding the Caldwell legacy, a force for good who would carry their name with pride and honor. But now, Ethan feared that his hard work had done more harm than good, turning his son into someone he no longer recognized. One evening, as Ethan sat alone in his sprawling study, a troubling thought crept into his mind. Had he failed as a father? The empire he had built, the sacrifices he had made, had they been for nothing? He stared out the window at the vast gardens of his Newport City mansion, illuminated by soft golden lights. The beauty and grandeur of his surroundings felt hollow without the assurance that his son shared his values. Ethan's mind raced with questions. Did Adrian love him, or did he see him only as a provider? Had the endless opportunities Ethan provided blinded his son to the importance of hard work? And most painfully, if Ethan were to disappear tomorrow, would Adrian even care? These questions plagued Ethan until they grew into a relentless need for answers. He realized that words would not suffice. Adrian's indifference could not be confronted with a mere conversation. Ethan needed to test his son, to force him into a position where his true character would reveal itself. The idea struck Ethan like lightning. He would abandon everything: his wealth, his status, his identity. He would step into a completely different world, leaving no clues behind, to see if Adrian would notice his absence and what he would do about it. It was a radical plan, but Ethan felt it was the only way to uncover the truth. That night, Ethan sat at his desk and wrote a series of letters, one to his lawyer, one to his trusted house staff, and another to his board of directors. Each letter explained that he would be gone indefinitely and that they were to act as stewards in his absence. But he left no explanation for Adrian. His son would have to act on instinct, without the safety net of his father's guidance or wealth. As the first light of dawn filtered through the mansion's towering windows, Ethan packed a small duffel bag with basic necessities, a few changes of clothes, some cash, and a small notebook. He paused in the grand foyer of his home, taking one last look at the life he had built. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the priceless art, all of it felt insignificant compared to the uncertainty ahead. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped out into the crisp morning air and walked away, leaving behind the empire he had spent a lifetime creating. As he disappeared into the bustling streets of Newport City, he felt a strange mix of fear and clarity. This was not just a test for Adrian, but also a journey for himself, a journey to discover whether he had truly succeeded as a father. Ethan Caldwell walked through the streets of Newport City, his head low, blending into the sea of ordinary people. For the first time in decades, he wasn't surrounded by security, personal assistance, or the trappings of his immense wealth. The duffel bag slung over his shoulder was light, but the weight of his decision bore down on him heavily. His heart wrestled with conflicting emotions, a deep sadness at leaving his life behind, a gnawing fear of what he might discover, and an unshakable resolve to find the truth about his son. Adrian Caldwell, his only child, had once been the light of his life. Ethan could still picture the boy running through the gardens, excitedly calling out for his father to see a new skill or achievement. The laughter, the curiosity, the eagerness to connect, it had all felt so genuine. Now, as Ethan navigated crowded sidewalks, he couldn't help but ask himself where it had all gone wrong. Had he failed Adrian by giving him too much? Had he shielded him from the struggles that had shaped his own character? These questions haunted Ethan, and yet they only strengthened his determination. He needed to know, if stripped of wealth and status, would Adrian still care for the man who had sacrificed so much for him? Ethan's first night away from home was humbling. He found himself sitting on a park bench as the city lights flickered in the distance. The air was cold, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself, feeling the discomfort of the hard surface beneath him. For a man who had once slept on silk sheets in a master bedroom larger than most apartments, this was a harsh contrast. Yet Ethan welcomed the discomfort. It reminded him of the man he had been before his success, a man who understood the value of every dollar. The next morning, Ethan sought refuge in a shelter. The staff barely glanced at him as they handed him a thin blanket and directed him to an open cot. For the first time in years, Ethan was surrounded by people who didn't know his name, who didn't care about his past achievements or his wealth. He observed the others in the room, men and women worn down by life, each carrying their own invisible burdens. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan adjusted to his new reality. He roamed the streets, ate modest meals at budget diners, and struck up conversations with strangers who knew nothing of his past. He lived on the small amount of cash he had brought, carefully budgeting every penny. His once polished shoes became scuffed, and his neatly trimmed beard grew scruffy. The anonymity gave him a strange sense of freedom, but it also reminded him of what he had left behind. Meanwhile, Ethan kept tabs on Adrian from a distance. Using a small amount of money, he hired a local private investigator to follow his son and report back to him. The reports painted a picture that both saddened and angered Ethan. Adrian showed no signs of concern over his father's sudden absence. Instead, he continued his life as if nothing had changed, throwing extravagant parties at the family mansion, driving luxury cars, and dining at exclusive restaurants. Ethan's heart sank each time he heard a new detail. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Adrian would show some sign of worry, some indication that he cared about more than just the wealth and comfort his father's empire provided. But there was none. Adrian seemed to revel in his newfound freedom, utterly indifferent to the man who had built the foundation of his life. One evening, as Ethan sat outside a small diner, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, a thought crossed his mind. What if Adrian never notices? What if he never looks for me? The possibility terrified him, not because he feared being forgotten, but because it would confirm his worst fears about Adrian's character. The son he had raised with so much care and love would prove to be nothing more than a spoiled product of privilege, incapable of understanding the deeper values Ethan had tried to instill. Yet even as these thoughts weighed on him, Ethan refused to give up hope. He reminded himself that this test wasn't just about Adrian's immediate reaction. It was about uncovering the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And if the truth was that Adrian needed to lose everything to grow into the man he was meant to be, Ethan was prepared to make that sacrifice. Late one night, Ethan walked to the mansion he had once called home. Standing across the street, hidden in the shadows, he gazed at the grand estate, its windows glowing warmly in the dark. He could see silhouettes through the curtains, Adrian hosting another lavish dinner party. Laughter and music spilled into the night, a cruel reminder of how little Adrian seemed to miss him. Tears pricked Ethan's eyes as he turned and walked away. His test had just begun, and already the answers he was receiving were breaking his heart. Ethan Caldwell's days blurred together in the gritty underbelly of Newport City. His routine was simple: wake up in a crowded shelter, find a meal from the kindness of strangers or the cheapest diners, and wander the streets observing life around him. Despite that he was resolute, this was not just a physical test, but an emotional and spiritual one, a journey to discover not only who his son was, but also the man he had become. Weeks into his disappearance, Ethan decided to take a bold step. Though he had observed Adrian's carefree lifestyle from a distance, he had yet to confront his son face to face. He wanted to see with his own eyes whether the boy he had raised still recognized him or cared to. With this in mind, Ethan learned from the private investigator that Adrian frequently dined at Villaggio's, an upscale restaurant known for its exclusivity and opulence. Ethan stood outside Villaggio's one crisp evening, watching as luxury cars pulled up to the entrance. Well-dressed patrons stepped out, greeted by bowing valets, and walked into the restaurant as if the world revolved around them. Among them, Ethan spotted Adrian. He was laughing with a group of colleagues, exuding the confidence and charm that had once made Ethan so proud. But now, that confidence felt hollow. A mask covering a man who had lost touch with the values his father had tried so hard to teach him. Ethan hesitated. His worn jacket and scuffed shoes stood in stark contrast to the polished image of the restaurant. Yet, he pushed himself forward. Stepping through the grand doors, he felt the weight of judgment settle on him immediately. The pristine decor, crystal chandeliers, white linens, and polished silverware, was a stark reminder of the life he had left behind. At the hostess stand, a young woman in a tailored suit looked him up and down, her disdain barely concealed. "I'm sorry, sir," she said curtly. "We don't have seating available for someone like you." Ethan's stomach churned, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Please," he said softly. "It's been a long day." The hostess didn't budge. Her eyes flicked dismissively to his unkempt appearance before she turned her attention to another customer. Ethan stood there for a moment, frozen by the humiliation, until he saw Adrian seated at a table near the back of the restaurant. Summoning his courage, Ethan approached. His heart pounded as he neared the table, where Adrian was surrounded by a group of equally polished executives. They were laughing, toasting, and oblivious to the world around them. "Adrian!" Ethan called softly at first, his voice trembling. When his son didn't respond, he called louder. "Adrian!" Adrian turned, his expression shifting from mild confusion to something colder. His gaze scanned Ethan's face, lingering on the wrinkles that stress had deepened and the worn clothes that told a story of hardship. "Do I know you?" Adrian asked, his tone sharp and dismissive. Ethan's heart shattered in that moment. "It's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father." Adrian's expression hardened further. He glanced around the table, clearly embarrassed, then leaned closer to Ethan. "I don't have time for this," he hissed. "Leave." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He stood there for a moment, stunned, before turning and walking out of the restaurant. The whispers and sideways glances from other diners followed him as he left, but they barely registered. All he could hear was Adrian's voice echoing in his mind. "I don't have time for this." Outside, the cool evening air stung his face. Ethan sat on a nearby bench, staring at the ground as the reality of his son's indifference sank in. Adrian hadn't just failed to recognize his father's struggles. He had outright rejected him. For hours, Ethan remained on that bench, grappling with a pain deeper than anything he had ever experienced. The boy he had loved so fiercely, the son he had worked so hard to provide for, had turned into a man who couldn't spare even a moment of kindness for him. But as the night wore on, that pain transformed into something else: determination. If Adrian couldn't understand the value of loyalty, gratitude, and hard work, Ethan would make him understand. He had given Adrian everything, and it had blinded him to the importance of earning one's way. Now, Ethan resolved to take everything away. The next morning, Ethan contacted his lawyer, James Garrow, using a prepaid phone he had purchased for emergencies. "I need you to make some changes," Ethan said. his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "What kind of changes?" James asked, his tone cautious. "Adrian's inheritance," Ethan replied. "Reduce it. Leave him enough to survive, but not enough to thrive." James hesitated. "Ethan, are you sure about this? It's drastic." "I've never been more sure of anything," Ethan said firmly. "This is the last lesson I can teach him." Ethan Caldwell's decision to alter Adrian's inheritance weighed heavily on him, but his resolve remained firm. As he walked the city streets, blending into the ebb and flow of ordinary life, he couldn't help but reflect on the boy Adrian had once been. He had raised him to believe in honesty, hard work, and loyalty, values that Ethan himself had clung to as he built his empire from nothing. But those values had been eroded by privilege, leaving behind a man Ethan could barely recognize. The lawyer, James Garrow, met with Ethan in a small, inconspicuous office he had rented for the day. Gone were the luxurious boardrooms with leather chairs and panoramic city views. This room had only a wobbly desk, mismatched chairs, and a faint smell of dampness. Yet Ethan felt more at ease here than he had in his towering corporate skyscraper. "You've been my attorney for decades, James," Ethan said, sliding a folder of documents across the desk. "I trust you to execute these changes without question." James opened the folder, scanning the contents, his brow furrowed as he read the instructions, a dramatic reduction in Adrian's inheritance and the immediate freezing of certain trust accounts. "Ethan," he said, setting the papers down, "I have to ask, why now? This isn't just about money, it's about legacy." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his decision. "James, I built everything I have for Adrian. Not for myself, not for recognition, but so he could have a better future. But somewhere along the way, he lost sight of what really matters. Maybe that's my fault for making things too easy. But I can't sit back and watch him destroy himself or my life's work. This is the only way to wake him up." James nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of Ethan's words. "I'll take care of it," he said, "but you know this will cause waves. Adrian isn't going to take it lightly." "I don't expect him to," Ethan replied, "but he needs to learn that nothing worth having comes without effort." Meanwhile, Ethan took another step toward uncovering the full truth about Adrian's life. He contacted Olivia Hart, a private investigator he had hired shortly after disappearing from his old life. Olivia was sharp, resourceful, and discreet, qualities Ethan appreciated now more than ever. When they met in a quiet corner of a local cafe, Olivia handed him a manila envelope. "You're not going to like what's in here," she said, her voice low. Ethan opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were reports, photographs, and financial records detailing Adrian's activities over the past few years. The contents were damning. Adrian had been involved in shady business deals, manipulating clients, and betraying the trust of loyal colleagues. He had cut corners to maximize profits, ignored ethical guidelines, and burned bridges with people who had once supported him. "This isn't just entitlement," Olivia said, pointing to one particularly incriminating document. "This is outright deceit. He's been leveraging your name and influence to pull off deals that border on illegal. If you weren't such a respected figure, he'd probably be facing lawsuits, or worse." Ethan's hands shook as he flipped through the evidence. His heart ached with betrayal. He had built his empire on principles of honesty and integrity, and to see Adrian disregard those principles so blatantly was a devastating blow. "I thought I knew him," Ethan said quietly, staring at a photo of Adrian shaking hands with a notorious businessman known for unethical practices. "I thought I raised him better than this." Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady but compassionate. "Sometimes people lose their way, but it doesn't mean they can't find their way back." Ethan nodded, though his mind was clouded with doubt. Could Adrian truly change? Or had the privilege Ethan provided irrevocably shaped him into someone who would never understand the values of hard work and integrity? The confrontation came sooner than Ethan anticipated. After receiving notification that his trust funds had been frozen and his inheritance drastically reduced, Adrian stormed into the family mansion. The once confident swagger that had defined him was replaced by a mix of anger and confusion. "Where is he?" Adrian barked, his voice echoing through the grand hall. Ethan emerged from the study, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm right here, Adrian." Adrian turned to face his father, his eyes blazing with fury. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, throwing a crumpled letter onto the table. "You think you can just take everything away from me? After everything I've done for this family?" "Everything you've done?" Ethan repeated, his voice steady but tinged with disappointment. "Adrian, you've done nothing but take. You've taken my wealth, my trust, and my values, and thrown them away as if they were meaningless." Adrian's jaw tightened. "I've worked hard for my success. You can't just cut me off like this." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "You call exploiting clients and betraying colleagues hard work? You call living off my name and reputation success? Adrian, you've proven to me that you don't understand the first thing about responsibility or integrity, and until you do, you won't see another dime of my fortune." Adrian's face paled as he realized the gravity of his father's words. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising. "I'm your son." "And I'm your father," Ethan replied, his voice breaking. "Which is why I'm doing this. You've failed me, Adrian, not because you made mistakes, but because you've refused to learn from them. This is your last chance to grow into the man I know you can be. Build your own life. Earn your success. Only then will you understand the true value of what I've given you." Adrian stared at his father, his anger mingling with disbelief and a flicker of something deeper, fear. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the mansion, slamming the door behind him. Ethan stood in the empty hall, his heart heavy but resolute. He had done what he believed was necessary, even if it meant risking his relationship with his son. Adrian Caldwell stormed out of the family mansion, his mind racing with anger and disbelief. The conversation with his father replayed in his head, each word cutting deeper than the last. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and stripped of the identity he had carefully constructed around wealth and power. To Adrian, his father's decision wasn't a lesson, it was an act of cruelty. Over the next few weeks, Adrian's life began to unravel. At first, he tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, assuming his father would come to his senses and reverse the decision. He threw lavish dinners, attended exclusive events, and continued his high-powered lifestyle. But without the backing of the family fortune, the cracks quickly began to show. The first blow came when one of his business ventures hit a financial roadblock. Adrian had relied heavily on his father's influence to secure funding and partnerships, but with Ethan gone, investors began to pull out. Without the safety net of his father's wealth, Adrian was forced to scramble for alternative resources. Deals fell through, and his once flourishing enterprises began to crumble. As word spread of Adrian's financial troubles, so did whispers among his so-called friends. The invitations to exclusive parties dwindled, and his circle of confidants grew smaller. People who had once flocked to his side for his wealth and status now distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone whose fortune was no longer guaranteed. One evening, Adrian found himself sitting alone in his penthouse apartment. The room, once a symbol of his success, now felt cold and empty. Bills piled up on the marble countertop, unopened and ignored. His phone buzzed with messages from creditors demanding payment, but he couldn't bring himself to answer. Desperation drove Adrian to seek help from those he had once looked down upon. He approached former colleagues and acquaintances he had manipulated or betrayed in the past, hoping they might extend him a lifeline. But the bridges he had burned offered no passage now. "I'm sorry, Adrian," one former associate said during a tense meeting at a coffee shop. "I trusted you once, and you used me to get ahead. I can't risk working with you again." The rejection stung, but it was far from the last. Each meeting, each phone call, ended with the same outcome. The world Adrian had built on shaky foundations was collapsing, and there was no one left to help him. One rainy evening, Adrian stood outside a luxury club he had frequented for years. He had hoped to reconnect with a few old friends, thinking that perhaps his charm and persistence might win them over. But as he approached the entrance, he was stopped by the bouncer. "Sorry, Mr. Caldwell," the man said, his tone professional but firm. "Your name's no longer on the list." Adrian blinked, rain dripping from his hair onto his expensive but now worn jacket. "What do you mean? I've been coming here for years." "Things change," the bouncer replied, his expression neutral. "You'll have to leave." Humiliated, Adrian turned and walked away, the rain soaking through his clothes. The club, once a symbol of his dominance in the city's elite social scene, was now another door slammed in his face. As Adrian's external world crumbled, so did his internal one. He began to question everything: his decisions, his relationships, even his identity. He thought back to his father's words in the mansion, the disappointment etched in Ethan's face. "You failed me, Adrian," his father had said. At the time, Adrian had dismissed the words as an overreaction. But now, in the silence of his empty apartment, they haunted him. Had he really failed? Had he squandered the opportunities his father had worked so hard to provide? Despite his pride, Adrian began to feel the stirrings of regret. He missed the days when his father's approval had been his greatest reward, when he had been guided by the values of hard work and integrity. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of those values, blinded by the allure of wealth and power. One particularly dark night, Adrian sat by the window of his apartment, watching the rain cascade down the glass. He reached for his phone and hesitated before dialing a familiar number. The call went straight to voicemail. "Dad," Adrian said after the beep, his voice cracking. "I don't know if you'll even listen to this, but I'm sorry. I don't know what to do anymore. Everything's falling apart, and I don't know how to fix it. I need your help." He hung up, unsure if the message would even reach his father. But for the first time in years, Adrian allowed himself to feel vulnerable. Meanwhile, Ethan listened to the voicemail in the quiet solitude of his temporary lodging. Adrian's voice, so full of pain and regret, brought tears to his eyes. This was the son he had been waiting to hear, the son who was finally beginning to understand the weight of his actions. But Ethan knew it wasn't enough. Adrian needed to face the consequences of his choices fully before he could truly change. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was a journey Adrian needed to walk on his own. In the weeks that followed Adrian's emotional voicemail, the storm that engulfed his life only grew fiercer. His ventures were failing faster than he could salvage them, and the reality of isolation became increasingly apparent. Without the wealth and influence he had taken for granted, Adrian faced the harsh truth of how superficial his relationships had been. The nights were the worst. Alone in his dimly lit apartment, he replayed his father's words, the voicemail he'd left, and the choices that had led him here. Sleep came sparingly, haunted by memories of his father's disappointed face. A gnawing question began to form. Had his father truly given up on him? Adrian wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. He couldn't go on like this. He needed to face his father, not just to plead for help, but to find clarity. One cold morning, Adrian mustered the courage to return to the family mansion. He hadn't been there since the night his father had disowned him, and the sight of its towering gates brought back a flood of emotions: anger, shame, and a tinge of longing. The mansion had always been a symbol of safety and comfort, yet now it felt imposing, almost alien. He stood outside the gate for what felt like an eternity, the chill biting through his coat. Finally, he pressed the intercom button. The voice on the other end wasn't his father's, but that of Marcus, the longtime butler who had served the Caldwell family faithfully for decades. "Mr. Adrian," Marcus said, his tone polite but firm, "your father is not available to see you." "Marcus, please," Adrian replied, desperation seeping into his voice. "I just need a few minutes. Tell him I'm here. I need to talk to him." There was a long pause before Marcus responded. "Wait here." Inside the mansion, Ethan sat in the study, listening as Marcus relayed Adrian's presence at the gate. He sighed, his heart torn. The voicemail had shown a glimmer of remorse in his son, but Ethan knew the conversation ahead would be pivotal. "Let him in," Ethan said after a moment. "But this isn't going to be easy for him. Or me." Adrian was led into the grand dining room, a space that had once been filled with warmth and laughter during family dinners. Now, it felt cold and formal. Ethan sat at the head of the long table, his posture straight and his expression unreadable. "Sit," Ethan said, motioning to the chair opposite him. Adrian obeyed, feeling like a child about to be scolded. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence stretching unbearably. Finally, Ethan broke the stillness. "Why are you here, Adrian?" Adrian hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Dad, I've made mistakes. I know that now, and I'm sorry. I really am." Right. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his expression unwavering. "Sorry for what exactly? For losing your fortune? For losing your friends? Or for losing yourself?" The question hit Adrian like a blow. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss. "For everything," he finally said, his voice low. "For disappointing you. For forgetting what you taught me. I see it now. I see how I've let you down, and I want to make it right." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "Do you even understand what making it right means? It's not about words, Adrian. It's about actions. For years, you've lived without accountability, without honor. Do you think a simple apology erases that?" Adrian flinched at the harshness of his father's words, but knew they were deserved. "No," he admitted. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'm here because I need to start somewhere." Ethan studied his son for a long moment. There was a vulnerability in Adrian's eyes that he hadn't seen in years. It was a small crack in the armor of arrogance that had defined him for so long. "You've hit rock bottom," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "And that's the only reason you're here. If I hadn't taken everything away, you'd still be living the same way, blind to the consequences of your actions. Am I wrong?" Adrian shook his head. "No, you're not." The admission surprised Ethan, though he didn't show it. "Then prove it," he said. "If you truly want to make it right, you'll start from nothing, just as I did. You'll rebuild your life, not with my money or my name, but with your own sweat and effort." Adrian's eyes widened. "You mean you're not going to help me at all?" "I've already helped you, Adrian," Ethan replied. "I gave you a foundation, an education, and every opportunity to succeed. You wasted it. Now, if you want to earn back my trust, you'll do it the hard way." Adrian's heart sank. Part of him had hoped his father might offer a lifeline, even a small one. But deep down, he knew Ethan was right. "How?" Adrian asked, his voice trembling. "How do I even start?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression softening slightly. "You'll figure it out. If you're serious about changing, you'll find a way. And when you do, I'll be here. But until then, you're on your own." Adrian stood, his legs shaky. The weight of his father's words settled heavily on his shoulders. He wanted to argue, to plead for more guidance, but he knew it would be futile. As he turned to leave, Ethan called out one final time. "Adrian." Adrian paused, looking back. "I don't hate you," Ethan said, his voice filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. "But I won't save you. That's something only you can do." Adrian left the mansion, the cold air hitting him like a slap. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone, but also, strangely, free. His father had laid out the challenge, and now it was up to him to rise to it. The road ahead would be uncertain and full of struggle, but Adrian resolved to take the first step, no matter how daunting it seemed. Adrian walked away from the mansion, his father's words echoing in his mind. "If you're serious about changing, you'll find a way." The gravity of the challenge weighed heavily on him, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of determination. His first steps were far from easy. With no financial support and no trust fund to fall back on, Adrian had to face the harsh realities of the world, something he had spent his life shielded from. He moved out of his luxury apartment, the rent now far beyond his means, and found himself in a modest studio on the edge of the city. Gone were the days of expensive cars and tailored suits. Adrian pawned what little he had left of value to cover his living expenses. The process was humbling, forcing him to acknowledge just how much he had relied on material possessions to define his worth. To make ends meet, Adrian took up a series of odd jobs, work he once would have scoffed at. He cleaned tables at a small diner, restocked shelves at a grocery store, and even worked night shifts unloading trucks at a warehouse. The physical labor was grueling, and the pay was barely enough to scrape by, but it was honest work. At first, Adrian resented the grind. He hated the blisters on his hands, the exhaustion that came with each shift, and the condescending looks he sometimes received from former acquaintances who stumbled across him. One evening at the diner, a former friend from his elite social circle walked in. "Adrian?" the man said, his tone dripping with disbelief as he eyed Adrian in an apron, holding a tray of dirty dishes. "Yeah, it's me," Adrian replied, his voice steady despite the embarrassment simmering beneath the surface. The man smirked. "How the mighty have fallen." Adrian clenched his jaw but said nothing, choosing instead to walk away. As the weeks turned into months, Adrian began to adjust to his new life. The resentment faded, replaced by a quiet sense of accomplishment. He wasn't just working to survive, he was learning. Each job taught him something new, the value of discipline, the importance of humility, and the strength that came from persevering through challenges. One evening, as he walked home from the warehouse, his mind wandered to his father. Ethan had built an empire from nothing, enduring struggles Adrian couldn't even fathom. For the first time, Adrian truly appreciated what his father had achieved and why he had been so disappointed by his son's entitlement. Determined to improve himself further, Adrian sought out opportunities for growth. He enrolled in a local business workshop, using the small amount of money he had saved from his jobs. The classes were filled with people from all walks of life, aspiring entrepreneurs, recent graduates, and even those who had lost everything and were trying to start anew. Adrian listened intently, taking notes and participating in discussions. He realized how much he had taken his education and connections for granted. The workshop reignited a spark in him, reminding him of the passion and drive he had once felt before arrogance had clouded his judgment. One of the assignments in the workshop was to create a business plan from scratch. Adrian poured his heart into the project, drawing from both his past experiences and the lessons he was learning in his new life. His idea was simple, yet meaningful. A mentorship program aimed at helping young people from underprivileged backgrounds develop the skills and confidence to succeed. The concept resonated deeply with him. He thought of how different his life might have been if he hadn't had his father's guidance, or if he had truly listened to it. This time, Adrian wanted to use what he had learned to make a positive impact. Adrian presented his plan at the final workshop session, standing nervously in front of the room. He spoke about his vision, the struggles that had inspired it, and the importance of creating opportunities for others. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. A woman approached him after the session, introducing herself as a local nonprofit director. "I love your idea," she said. "If you're serious about making it happen, I'd love to help." Adrian felt a surge of hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, he saw a path forward, not just to rebuild his life, but to create something meaningful. Back at his tiny apartment, Adrian sat by the window, reflecting on how far he had come. His hands were calloused, his bank account nearly empty, but his heart felt full in a way it never had before. He picked up his phone and stared at his father's number. This time, he didn't call. He wanted to wait, to show Ethan through actions rather than words that he was changing. Adrian knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. Months turned into a year, and Adrian's life had transformed in ways he never imagined. His mentorship program, New Horizons, began as a small project but steadily grew into a thriving initiative. With the help of the nonprofit director and a few dedicated volunteers, Adrian secured funding, established partnerships with local schools, and started hosting workshops for young people who needed guidance. Through his work, Adrian met teenagers and young adults whose stories humbled him. Many of them had faced hardships far greater than anything he had ever experienced. Some had grown up in poverty, others in broken homes. Yet their determination to overcome their circumstances inspired Adrian deeply. One evening, Adrian sat in the small office he had rented for the program. On the desk in front of him was a stack of thank you letters from students whose lives had been changed by New Horizons. He read each one, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. Despite his successes, there was still one person he hadn't reached: his father. Adrian thought of Ethan often, replaying their last conversation in his mind. He had wanted to prove to his father that he could change, but the fear of rejection held him back from reaching out. What if it wasn't enough? But tonight, something felt different. With a deep breath, Adrian picked up his phone and dialed the number he hadn't called in over a year. At the Caldwell mansion, Ethan was sitting in his study, a book in his lap, when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and froze. Adrian. For a moment, he debated whether to answer. Their last conversation had been painful, but Ethan had never stopped wondering about his son. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the call button. "Hello?" Ethan's voice was calm but guarded. "Dad," Adrian said, his voice steady despite the nerves gripping him. "It's me. I just wanted to talk if you'll let me." Ethan leaned back in his chair, surprised by the sincerity in his son's tone. "I'm listening," he said. Adrian took a deep breath. I wanted to thank you for everything, for the lessons you taught me, even if it took me far too long to learn them. You were right. I needed to start from scratch to understand the value of what I'd been given. And I have. There was a pause, and Ethan could hear the raw emotion in Adrian's voice. I've been working hard, Dad. I started a mentorship program to help people who didn't have the same opportunities I did. It's small, but it's growing, and it's the most meaningful thing I've ever done. Ethan's heart softened, though he kept his tone measured. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to know that I'm not asking for anything, Adrian said. I don't want money or the family name or anything like that. I want you to be proud of me again. The sincerity in Adrian's words struck Ethan deeply. For a long time, he had feared that his son would never change, that entitlement and arrogance had consumed him. But now, listening to Adrian speak, Ethan could hear the growth, the humility, and the determination in his voice. Adrian, Ethan said after a long silence, I've always wanted you to succeed, not in business or wealth, but as a person. It sounds like you're finally starting to understand what that means. I am, Adrian said quietly, and I know I still have a long way to go, but I promise I won't stop trying. Ethan's voice softened. I'd like to see what you've been working on. If you'll have me, that is. Adrian's chest tightened with emotion. I'd like that, Dad. I'd really like that. The following weekend, Ethan arrived at the small community center where New Horizons hosted its workshops. The space was modest, but filled with energy and warmth. Posters with motivational quotes lined the walls, and tables were scattered with papers, books, and laptops. Adrian greeted him at the door, his hands trembling slightly. Thanks for coming, he said, his voice earnest. Ethan looked around, taking in the scene. This is your work? He asked. It is, Adrian said. Let me show you. Adrian led his father through the center, introducing him to staff members and participants. Ethan listened as young people shared how the program had helped them gain confidence, learn new skills, and set goals for their futures. One young man, a shy high school senior named Marcus, approached Ethan nervously. Mr. Caldwell, I just wanted to say thank you. If it weren't for Adrian and this program, I wouldn't be applying to college right now. He believed in me when no one else did. Ethan looked at Adrian, pride glimmering in his eyes for the first time in years. You've done good work here, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Adrian smiled, his heart full. I had a good example to follow. That evening, Ethan and Adrian shared a quiet dinner at a small cafe near the center. For the first time in years, their conversation flowed easily, filled with mutual respect and understanding. As they parted ways, Ethan placed a hand on his son's shoulder. You've earned my trust back, Adrian, he said. Not with words, but with actions. I'm proud of the man you're becoming. Adrian felt a lump in his throat, but managed to smile. Thank you, Dad. That means everything to me. Months passed, and Adrian continued to forge his path. New Horizons was now a well-established program, with a growing reputation for its impact on young lives. Adrian had earned the respect of his community, and more importantly, he had earned back his father's trust. The two had developed a new relationship, one built on honesty, vulnerability, and mutual admiration. But even as Adrian was making strides in his personal growth, he knew that there was still one last hurdle to overcome. Despite their reconnection, there were still gaps in their relationship. Adrian felt that his father, though proud of him, was still watching him closely, unsure if this transformation was permanent. Adrian needed to prove that he wasn't just capable of change, but that he could carry the weight of the responsibility his father had once placed on him. It wasn't just about New Horizons anymore. It was about his ability to succeed on his own terms, without relying on the legacy of the Caldwell name or the wealth that had once defined him. It was late one evening when Adrian received a call from his father. Adrian, I need you to meet me tomorrow morning. Ethan's voice was firm, but not unkind. There's something important we need to discuss. Adrian felt a flutter of nerves. He hadn't heard his father sound so serious in a long time. Of course, Dad. I'll be there. The next day, Adrian arrived at the Caldwell mansion, uncertain of what awaited him. The grandeur of the place had always intimidated him, but today it felt like a distant reminder of a life he no longer wanted to be defined by. Ethan greeted him in the study, the same place where they had their last difficult conversation. There was an air of tension in the room, and Adrian could feel it. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, his voice steady, "about everything you've done over the last year, the mentorship program, your growth, the man you're becoming. I'm impressed. Truly." Adrian nodded, still waiting for the catch. "But," Ethan continued, "there's something I need to know. You've taken so many positive steps, but you've done it without the responsibility of running the business, without the weight of the family name." Adrian's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the test coming. "Adrian, I'm offering you the opportunity to take control of Caldwell Enterprises. I want you to lead the company, to take the reins and prove that you can succeed, not just in your personal life, but in business as well. This is the ultimate test." The room fell silent as Adrian processed his father's words. He had spent years resenting the weight of the family legacy, the pressure of the business world, and the expectations placed on him. But now, with the man he had become standing at the precipice of a new chapter, he couldn't deny that a part of him was drawn to the challenge. Adrian had worked tirelessly to build something of his own, and the prospect of taking on the Caldwell empire filled him with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Could he truly handle it? Was he ready to balance his newfound values with the demands of the corporate world? "I don't know, Dad," Adrian said after a long pause. "I've spent so long rejecting everything that came with the company. I've had to find my own way outside of all this." He gestured to the opulence of the mansion around him. "I've learned a lot, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for the job." Ethan studied him carefully, as if weighing his every word. "That's the test, Adrian. You've grown into a man who values integrity, loyalty, and hard work. Can you take those values into the boardroom? Can you build a business that's not just successful, but ethical, not just profitable, but meaningful? That's what I'm asking." Adrian sat in silence, the enormity of the decision settling over him. He had spent years avoiding the weight of the family business, but now it felt like the final step in his journey. Could he merge the two parts of himself, the man who had found purpose in his work with new horizons, and the heir to a legacy built on ambition and power? "I'll do it," Adrian finally said, his voice firm. "I'll take control, but I promise you this, Dad. I'll do it my way. I'll build a business that's not just about making money. It will be about making a difference." Ethan's eyes gleamed with approval. "That's all I've ever wanted, Adrian, to see you take control and succeed on your own terms. You're ready." The decision was made. Adrian spent the next few weeks preparing to step into the role as CEO of Caldwell Enterprises. It wasn't easy. He had to learn to navigate the complexities of corporate politics, deal with executives who had once underestimated him, and handle the immense pressure that came with running such a powerful company. But Adrian was different now. His values had evolved, and he wasn't about to let the greed and manipulation that had once consumed the company define his leadership style. He brought a new perspective to the boardroom, one rooted in transparency, collaboration, and a focus on long-term sustainability over short-term profits. The transition wasn't without its challenges. Adrian faced resistance from some of the old guard within the company who were skeptical of his approach. But he stood firm, making it clear that the Caldwell legacy would no longer be about wealth for the sake of wealth. It would be about creating something that would stand the test of time, a company that would contribute positively to society. As Adrian worked through the obstacles, he realized that the business world wasn't all bad. It was a tool, a powerful one, that could be used for good. And with that understanding, he poured his energy into shaping Caldwell Enterprises into a force for change. Months later, when Adrian sat across from his father once more, the sense of pride and accomplishment between them was palpable. Ethan had watched as Adrian steered the company toward a new era where ethical practices and corporate responsibility became the cornerstones of Caldwell Enterprises. "You've done it, Adrian," Ethan said quietly, a note of admiration in his voice. "You've shown me that you're more than capable of handling this legacy. You've done it your way, and I couldn't be prouder." Adrian smiled, but his eyes were full of something deeper, gratitude. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without your challenge, without your belief in me." Ethan nodded. "I've always believed in you. I just needed to see that you believed in yourself." And in that moment, Adrian realized that the true inheritance he had received from his father wasn't the business or the wealth. It was the chance to redefine what success truly meant. Adrian stood in the boardroom, his hand resting on the polished oak table. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the weight of responsibility hung heavy in the air. As the CEO of Caldwell Enterprises, he had faced challenges that tested his resolve, decisions that demanded sacrifices, hard lessons, and moments of doubt. But in this moment, as he looked around the room at the faces of his colleagues, some new, some old, he knew he had made the right choice. The business was flourishing, but it wasn't just the numbers that mattered anymore. It was the transformation that had taken place over the last year. The transformation within himself, his company, and his relationship with his father. Adrian had redefined success, not as the pursuit of wealth, but as the creation of value that could outlast any balance sheet. And now, Caldwell Enterprises wasn't just an empire built on profit. It was a beacon for corporate responsibility, innovation, and sustainable growth. The initiatives he had put in place were making a difference in communities across the country. He had shown the world that a company could be both profitable and ethical, competitive and compassionate. But for all his success, Adrian's mind often returned to that pivotal moment, the one where his father had tested him, the moment he had been asked to prove himself not just as a businessman, but as a man who understood the true weight of responsibility. And now, with the legacy of Caldwell Enterprises in his hands, Adrian knew that his greatest achievement wasn't the millions in profits or the accolades from the business world. It was the reconciliation with the man who had shaped him, for better or worse. One evening, Adrian invited his father to the office. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the sleek modern furnishings of the boardroom. Ethan arrived with a quiet but proud expression, a slight smile on his lips as he took a seat across from Adrian. "I've been thinking about everything we've been through," Adrian began, his voice softer than usual. "About the past, the lessons, the mistakes, and everything that led me to this moment." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "When I first took over this company, I thought I was going to prove to you and to myself that I could do it, that I could carry the legacy of Caldwell Enterprises in a way that made us both proud. But the more I've worked, the more I've realized that it isn't about proving anything. It's about living up to the values you taught me." Ethan's expression softened. "What values do you mean?" "The values that matter," Adrian said, his voice steady. "Integrity, responsibility, leadership that serves people, not just shareholders. You taught me about ambition, yes, but you also taught me about what matters beyond success. And I've come to understand that what we leave behind, what we build, is far more important than what we accumulate." There was a long pause as Ethan absorbed his son's words. It wasn't easy to admit, but he had always hoped for this, that Adrian would understand the true meaning of legacy. "You've changed, Adrian," Ethan finally said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. "And I think I've changed too. I see now that what I was doing, pushing you so hard, it wasn't just about the company or the money. It was about fear. Fear of losing everything I'd worked for, fear of letting go of control. But I see now that it was never about control. It was about trust. And I trust you." Adrian's heart swelled at his father's words. He had never imagined this moment would come. The moment when Ethan, the man who had shaped him, the man he had tried so hard to distance himself from, finally understood the lessons he had learned. "I won't let you down," Adrian said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "I'll make sure that Caldwell Enterprises isn't just a company. It's a legacy of integrity. It's a place where the work we do matters, where we create something meaningful for future generations." Ethan stood up and walked around the table, placing a hand on Adrian's shoulder. "I know you will," he said softly. "I know you will." That evening, after their conversation, Adrian stood by the window of his office, looking out over the city skyline. The lights from the buildings below twinkled like stars, a reflection of the hard work, sacrifice, and vision that had gone into building something that would last. But as Adrian gazed at the horizon, he realized that it wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about something deeper, something that transcended wealth, status, and success. It was about family, about love, about the bond between a father and son that had been tested, broken, and then healed. He had once feared his father's shadow, but now he saw it differently. He understood that the true legacy wasn't in the empire he had inherited. It was in the lessons passed down, the values shared, and the unconditional love that had survived even the hardest of tests. Adrian turned away from the window and looked at the framed photograph of his father on the wall, taken during their earlier years together. It was a reminder of the past, but also of how far they had come. And now, standing at the helm of Caldwell Enterprises, Adrian knew that his journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, decisions to make, and lives to impact. But as he stood there, with his father's trust in him and the strength of his own beliefs, Adrian was ready. The legacy was his to shape, and he would make it a legacy worth leaving. In the end, Adrian's journey was not just about reclaiming the Caldwell legacy. It was about redefining what it meant to truly succeed. The wealth, the business empire, the power, these things were merely tools. The real value lay in the lessons he had learned, the people he had helped, and the bond he had rekindled with his father. Adrian realized that the legacy of Caldwell Enterprises was never meant to be built solely on profit. It was meant to be built on integrity, compassion, and a desire to leave the world better than they had found it. He had inherited not just a company, but the chance to lead with purpose, a chance to create a new standard for business, one that valued people over power. And in that moment, Adrian understood that the greatest wealth a person could ever achieve was not in money or status, but in the love, respect, and trust of those who truly mattered. As father and son stood side by side, looking forward to the future, they both knew that their legacy, one of transformation, redemption, and hope, was just beginning. And it would be a legacy built not on what they had, but on what they had given. For Adrian, this was just the beginning of his journey, not as the son of a billionaire, but as a man in his own right, ready to make his mark on the world in a way that truly mattered. And that was the true inheritance. The chance to live a life of purpose and to pass that on to the next generation. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey and listening to the full story. We hope it left you with powerful lessons about family, legacy, and the true meaning of success. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that challenge the status quo and inspire change. Your support means the world to us and helps us create even more powerful narratives to share with you. Stay tuned for more stories of transformation, lessons learned the hard way, and journeys that will touch your heart. Thank you again for watching.